In this video lesson, we will describe the basic economy, demographics, and social structure and life of the 17th century colonies, and compare and contrast the different forms of society and ways of life for the southern colonies and New England. The Chesapeake colonies grew very slowly and suffered repeated epidemics of disease, including malaria, typhoid, yellow fever, and dysentery, and had a terrible death toll. Populations would have declined except for the arrival of new immigrants from England, mostly single men in their late teens and early 20s. Most young men and women arriving in the Chesapeake came as indentured servants, those willing to work under contract for several years in exchange for payment of their passage to America and other benefits at the end of their contracts. Most of the young men who came to the Chesapeake died soon after their arrival, victims of either disease or accidents. Most who survived could not find marriage partners for several reasons. There were very few women that came to the Chesapeake, and eligible women who did come were soon married. In 1650, men outnumbered women nearly 6 to 1. By 1700, that ratio had been reduced to 3 to 1. Nuclear families were very few and easily destroyed by the death of a partner, typically within 7 years. Consequently, it was very rare to find any children who reached adulthood under the care of both parents. Almost none of them knew any grandparents. By the early 18th century, Chesapeake life had improved as native-born inhabitants developed some immunity to the killer diseases that had ravaged their parents' and grandparents' generations. More families were formed as the number of women in the Chesapeake area increased. In turn, this allowed the white population to grow through natural increase. By this time, Virginia had become the most populous of all the colonies, followed by Massachusetts in New England and Maryland in the Chesapeake. By 1700, planters in the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and Northern Carolina were producing over 40 million pounds of tobacco for export to England. Despite failing tobacco prices, planters increased their acres under cultivation to compensate for declining incomes, initiating a vicious cycle of production which created a need for more labor and exhausted more soil. Planters could not afford to hire free labor because land was abundant and free people preferred to work their own land. Unable to afford African slaves, planters chose indentured servants and the headright system, pioneered by Sir Edwin Sandys of Virginia. This system gave a master 50 acres for each indentured servant he bought. Thus, the master reaped the benefits of land ownership. Masters financially able to capitalize on the headright system accumulated large amounts of real estate holdings and became great merchant planters. They marketed crops, imported goods, and extended credit to smaller yeoman farmers. Freedom dues were given to servants who completed their contract, typically a small piece of land, some clothing, and food to see them on their way. By 1700, Chesapeake planters had imported nearly 100,000 indentured servants. These were white slaves who accounted for over 75% of all European immigrants to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century. Servant life was hard because they didn't control who bought their contracts. They could be bought and sold several times. There were severe punishments for breaking laws and rules. Females could not marry until their contract was up, and they suffered a high mortality rate from disease, from accidents, from contaminated water, and from not being fed properly. Still, indentured servants continued coming to the Chesapeake. They were lured by hopes of survival, the prospect of having freedom upon completion of their contract, and the less appealing alternatives if they stayed in England, where there were too many people available for work.